We'll go ahead and get started, and we'll probably have some more folks joining in, hopefully. We want to welcome everyone to SBIA's final SBIC Council meeting of 2020. And I don't know if everyone's like me, but I think a lot of us are probably looking forward to closing the books on 2020. It has been probably the most challenging year of most everyone on this call's lifetime. But there have been some good things happen amid all the gloom. There have been some silver linings, and things are looking to get better as we head into 2021. Today's meeting, we want to focus on talking about some final things that are going to happen or could possibly happen down the stretch in Congress. I'm going to give you an update on the SBIC year-end data and let you see what's happening in the SBIC program, some of the improvements, some of the good things that are going on there. And Brett's going to give an update on some other matters related to SBIA and SBIC membership. And with that, I guess I'll start with just a brief government relations update before I hand it off to Brett. Right now, as we speak, Congress is voting on the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a must-pass bill. It's something that passes every year, and it's also a piece of legislation that lots of different things get attached to. In years past, we've tried to get all manner of SBIC, BDC legislation attached to that. None of the things that we were looking to get included are in that bill this year, but it's a vehicle that has to move every year, and there were threats to hold it up. Senator Rand Paul threatened, but that was thwarted at the last minute. So that bill is about to pass the Senate. It passed the House earlier this week, passed both chambers with veto-proof majorities. The president had been threatening to veto it, but it's going to pass by veto-proof majorities in both chambers. So that'll move on to the next item of business, which is funding the government for one more week. Earlier this week, the House passed, again with a veto-proof majority, a bill to extend government funding, which is set to run out at midnight tonight, to extend it for one more week. So December 18th will be the new deadline for government funding, and at which point, if they go past that, we'll have a government shutdown. But the one-week extension was put in place to allow another week for congressional leaders to negotiate on another COVID relief package. Obviously, there's been lots of talk. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that in the news. You've been reading about it. Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate have had a difficult time coming to agreement on a package that will provide more small business relief, more unemployment relief, lots of medical provisions, healthcare related things in there. There are some sticking points that the parties cannot agree on. Leader McConnell, one of his primary goals and priorities is to provide liability protections for businesses. And he said that's got to be a must in any bill that they do. On the Democratic side, funding for state, local, and tribal governments. That's something that the Democrats have not wanted to give up. There's a bipartisan bill that has been put together by a group of about 8 senators. It's been endorsed by a group called the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, which is a group of moderate Democrats and Republicans who look to solve problems. And but that bill has gotten nowhere with the party leadership. And the two issues that I mentioned, the liability protections and the state and local funding, are really what's holding the bill up. Leader McConnell earlier this week offered to Speaker Pelosi to remove his insistence on the liability protections if she would drop the insistence on the state and local funding. But there was no agreement on that. They really wanted to try to push through some of the things that they had broad bipartisan support on, like more PPP funding, like more unemployment insurance. So really, the things that are holding up this negotiation are unrelated to the SBIA world as far as more small business funding. As far as PPP, there's a $908 billion package that I mentioned that this bipartisan group came out with. It offers another round of PPP funding. $300 billion is what there would be for more PPP in that package. but no bill text has been released on that. There's been some bullet point items, a summary of what would be in there released, but no actual legislative text. So even people we talk to on the Hill that don't really know all of the finer details of that package. That's the baseline that a lot of people want to work from, but again, party leadership on both sides seems to have different goals. So right now, we're looking at a vote today to extend the government funding for one more week to get it through till next Friday. If there's no agreement on a COVID package, there would be another vote to extend government funding, and that would probably carry us through for, I'm hearing up to 3 months, sometime in the 2 to 3 month range, to give President-elect Biden time to get in instead of, government funding running out 2 days after he gets in office. And then at that point in time, you'd be looking at sometime in March when the government would have to, Congress would have to come up with a longer term funding plan. So that's where we stand right now. Still lots of moving parts on a COVID package and on any small business provisions. But again, those are not the controversial pieces of this. And my anticipation, and Brett, I'll let you speak to this as well, is that any type of second round of PPP will be pretty similar to what we've had in the past, maybe with some slight modifications. But at this point, I don't anticipate anything being radically different than what we've seen in the past. And with that, Brett, I'll hand it off to you for any comments you have on that.
Thank you, Will. That was a pretty good update, a very good update. I'd also like to start off by saying thank you to Tyson as the chair of the SBIC Council and Patrick as the vice chair. We are keeping them apprised on a regular basis of these issues as they develop as a sounding board to make sure that we're reflecting the SBIC's views and priorities when dealing with Congress, and Will is all over it. I will mention to start off with that many of you know Tani Weibensinger, our head of government relations. Tani was named yesterday by the Hill newspaper as one of the top 100 lobbyists in all of Washington. That's over 12,000 registered lobbyists. That includes probably another 10,000 of folks who aren't registered lobbyists. They also included on the list. That are influencers. So that's better than the top 1%. So you've got some great folks going toe to toe with folks in Congress on your behalf. You got Will, you got Tani, you got David Parkhurst as well. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. So a couple things real quick to add to Will's point. Our expectation is that if there is a PPP, and right now there really is a good bit of partisan dysfunction as far as getting a package across the finish line, that it'll be a smaller loan amount, probably in the $2 to $3 million range, smaller employee number, probably the 200 to 300 person range. There may be a injury standard of reduction in revenues of 25 to 35% or something along those lines. It's worth noting that the banks are staunchly opposed to having an injury test like that, because the banks are concerned that if they're putting money out with the expectation that it's going to be paid back and that there's a guarantee associated with it, and it ends up that the loss was 29% and there's a 30% injury standard, they're going to be on the hook for something that may lose. And given all the after the fact FAQs and other things that have happened in the PPP, I can understand why the banks have that concern. So they're going to try to work on that, but there's broad bipartisan consensus that there really needs to be some type of PPP. The question is what? And the question is what other issues are associated with it. One of the questions that came up on the Q&A feature, which I think is an excellent question, is the issue of taxes and how the expensing as it relates to the PPP kick in. The PPP was supposed to be tax-free when it was waived, but to not allow for the deductibility of the expenses that you otherwise would not have incurred had you just laid off your employees is a real issue. I'll mention there that is not an SBIC specific issue. That goes to all 5,500,000 small businesses that were able to get the PPP loans. They all have that problem. So we are a fraction of that, but there's a broad group of folks, ourselves included, who are saying, hey, they need to fix that and get that done. I do expect that they would get something done and get that fixed if there is a package, but there's a big if. Every time you put if in front of something in Washington, reduces probability of happening by 50%. So we're working on that and staying apprised of it. But there's a lot happening there. So a couple things I want to just flag for you all. One, we did have our last month call with The SBA senior staff, Don DeFawcett with the SBA, who runs the SBIC program, was on that call. He was getting over COVID and not feeling very well. That's why you didn't hear him talking very much, but he was a real trooper about it. We expect our next call to be January 26th, which will be after the new inauguration of President-elect Biden. And so we'll see if there's somebody in charge at that point. I have spoken several times with the transition team as it relates to SBA to let them know what's going on and how it affects you. And so we're in good place there. I will mention on January 26th, we are having our first conference for the SBIA. I would ask that you participate and have your firm participate in that. Again, we're going to have as a pre-early session for that, this SBIC Office of Investment discussion as part of that conference. So please register for that conference. Please also share on LinkedIn your engagement on that conference so that we can make sure we're broadening out your exposure to it. We'll also be having an SBIC update and discussion with some of the SBA staff next week. SBIA does a number of lunch and learn webinar series. The next one is on the SBIC program. It includes some of the SBIC staff. Winston and Strawn is sponsoring that one. And that's December 16th. So you'll be able to do a deep dive in there and get some of the questions asked that you want asked. I'll also mention that we're going to have our Deal Summit in Chicago. That'll be in person. It'll be our first in-person conference, and that'll be a Deal Summit on June 2nd and 3rd. So we'll go from there. But I want to put those all on your radar screen as we go. So we do have the new data from the fiscal year 2020. Fiscal year 2020 ended September 30th. The SBA has not formally released that data. The reason why they have not is all data and all documents released by the federal government are supposed to be Americans with Disability Act compliant. That includes digital documents so that blind people can read them via their computer. And charts and graphs are very difficult to do that with. And so they do that for all the other parts of SBA, but they haven't done it for here. And so they're trying to get that done. But I have the version that is not visually disabled qualified, but the data is still there. And so I want to share just a couple pieces of that data for you that we can circulate. But the total number of debenture licenses last year increased, which was good because it had been flat to negative for the previous couple of years. The amount of regulatory capital increased significantly from $16.7 billion in 2019 to $18.5 billion in fiscal year 2020. At the same time, the SBA's capital at risk, as they call it, which actually is a bit of a misnomer, but the amount of commitments they have and leverage outstanding dropped by about 300 million. And SBA leverage overall outstanding dropped by about 300 million. So it's the SBA's risk exposure has gone down while private capital has gone up. It's also worth noting that liquidations for conventional SBIC debenture funds have not changed in a meaningful way. There was not a big pop this year. I thought there might be given the economic disruptions that occurred, but it's meaningful. But overall, some of the data points that I do think are relevant to you, particularly SBICs that are levered SBICs, is that the amount of financings by SBICs in fiscal year 2020 dropped by 17%. Given that the economy was closed for nearly a quarter, I'm surprised it's not more. But generally, the biggest drop off were in equity and debt with equity features at 18%, and straight debt dropped by 16%. The number of companies dropped by around 29% that were financed. There were a lot of follow-on investments, not surprisingly, of you all supporting your companies as best you can. And non-levered SBICs, many of which are doing more equity, also dropped by around 17% of total dollars invested. But it was interesting is that the biggest drop-off was debt with equity features by those non-levered SBICs at a 48% drop year over year. The number of licenses picked up significantly. As you know, we had a real problem for several years with the incompetence of Associate Administrator Joe Shepard and his hostility to making the program work. Since his departure from the Office of Investment in March, you've seen a meaningful pickup in the number of licenses. They licensed 26 funds for fiscal year 2020. In reality, they licensed around 31 to 32 that were funds that were licensed but they hadn't formally gotten the signature across the finish line by the administrator because of the other year-end stuff that was happening. So in reality, it was about 32 funds that were licensed. About 21 of those were debenture funds, and 5 of those were bank-owned or non-levered. And I think the bulk of those 5 that aren't counted in these formal numbers were debenture funds. So you're talking about 26 funds licensed, and compare that to the previous year of 15, that's a meaningful increase. And the licensing pipeline also decreased by a meaningful number, but that's because they were pushing funds through the pipeline and getting them licensed. So you had a 10% reduction of total in the pipeline, but the number of that are actually in licensing in the final stages is up 63%. You're also seeing a significant number of first-time applicants coming in. It's a 75% increase year over year, and almost all of that is in the second half of the fiscal year 2020. As you're seeing more and more interest in the program now that it's being allowed to work, because the underlying mechanics and economics of the program are meaningful. And as the banks pull back, and I am hearing a lot more about banks pulling back and being far more aggressive in their senior lender positions, where they were more forgiving at the early stages of the pandemic crisis as far as the economics of it, they really are pulling back and getting very aggressive. And so some of the sub-debt lenders, one, need to be aware of that and work with banks that you trust. And 2, there's an opportunity to backfill that hole as those senior lenders get more aggressive as far as their locking down and sending to receivership or a workout group, or just not doing new transactions in our space. So you're looking at a meaningful increase in licensing, a much shorter period of licensing. It's also worth noting that for debenture SBICs, the amount of commitments issued increased 30% for fiscal year 2020. And that was after a meaningful reduction in commitments issued in fiscal year 2019, because things had been gummed up and we're really back in the right on the right path, and things are going well. It's also worth noting that the number of examinations issued increased 34%, a meaningful increase. Most of that was in the second half of the year, as again, the program was allowed to work, and frankly, it stopped being sabotaged by a unique individual, the likes of which we've never had and will never have again. But that's a meaningful piece, because that lets you all operate, have your exams finished up, get your draws moving, let you operate, move through the licensing process, and that's coming together very well. I will note that the percentage of reports with major findings increased to about 29%, excuse me, 22%, which is a 29% year increase. About 1 out of 5 of examinations find a major flaw. A lot of those are conflict of interest or failure to document things adequately. I think that's something that we as an industry need to be more careful of and make sure that we're keeping our side of the street clean to make sure that you don't have any headaches. But we're going to be working with the Office of Examinations to get them to share more of those specific issues that are causing people to get findings, so you can make sure that throughout the year you're operating your fund in a way that keeps you on the right side of the law. And so that's those are the big ones for the data. And we've got some questions here, so I'll stop here to answer some questions that have come up as related to my data so far. So what will happen to the licensing agency committee meeting in January given the change in administration? It's an excellent question. In the first quarter of pretty much every new administration, Republican or Democrat, things always get slowed up. You have new people, you have new administrators, new staff looking at these things. And if you're new to government and you sit down, and one of the first things that happens is you get a stack of paper a couple inches thick and says, here, please sign off on a $175 million loan that's a non-recourse loan. I think you're going to think about it and go, wait, what am I signing? And so it is common that things get slowed up in the first quarter. It's actually often faster for the first month or so, because the career civil servants are running things. They know what they're doing. They get them. They get things moving through quickly. It's really when the politicals come in and they're just figuring out, which way's up, that gets slowed down. So I think you very well may see a slowdown in January and February, and then by March it begins to pick up, and then they're back off to the races. But they clearly want to make this program work, and so I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. It'll take a little bit of time. Why is it taking so long for the administrator to actually sign the licenses? And is this likely to improve next year? If so, what is your expectation as the time frame? Historically, it takes 2 to 3 weeks to get through that process, that final signature. That's normal, that's reasonable. There's a person called the Executive Secretariat for every cabinet secretary, and they basically put together a big wad of documents for that principal to sign that are legally binding every day. And that executive secretariat's job is to make sure every legal I is dotted and T crossed to make sure it happens. And so it takes a couple days to get that done, make sure everything's signed off, make sure that legal is signed off on everything, that it is legible, and then you have to get in front of the principal to sign it. And so as it relates to the year end, at the year end, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things that a principal has to sign. So that's why that's delayed. So when you get voted on approval for a new license, you really shouldn't sweat anything until it's been at least 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, that's when things get a little bit squirrely. We can engage and get things unstuck for you. But I really wouldn't read too much in that. That's true of every government agency, and it's just sort of part of the necessary processes to get that license. But again, in the first part of a new administration, getting one of these applications on your desk, and you have 5 or 6 of them at $100 to $175 million a pop, whoever's signing that inevitably goes, what are you asking me to do? Are you trying to pull the wool over my eyes? Is this what is this? So I would not be surprised if there were a little bit of delays there in the first quarter, but they won't be huge, and we can get them unstuck pretty quickly. Pretty much all the time, but we don't want to be trying to weigh in and get things unstuck when it's still in the reasonable, week to 2 week time frame to get that signature. So let me stop there. Any other questions that folks want to ask? Your Q&A button's down at the bottom. I'd be happy to answer them before I move on to a couple other things that I just want to flag for you. Okay, I don't see any coming up, but if any come up, let me know. So there are a couple things that I want to flag for you and make sure you're aware of. As the year end is coming, the exec board is working on the new dues model. They hope to finalize that today or Monday. So you'll be getting your dues renewal. I would implore you to pay your dues and to encourage every SBIC who is a member to pay your dues. In some cases, your dues will be going up. In some cases, your dues will be flat. It'll depend upon your circumstances, but your dues really do impact your ability to operate your fund. We very much overpunch our weight, but for the lobbying team that you pay for, PPP would not have been available to your portfolio companies. I think that clearly protects your LPs, and it clearly protects you, and it frankly changed the careers of many of you to have that. Also, the making sure the program is operating and working, and that we can get that unstuck. That is a real, with those dues dollars, it really lets us help you operate your fund in a meaningful way. So I would implore you to pay your dues, recognize that our costs are largely fixed. Our revenue next year will drop by nearly 50% from our events that we hold or will not be able to hold early on. So we need to be able to keep the people on our team that are able to advocate for you and make sure we keep that moving. So particularly that'll be important as you'll have a new chair of the Small Business Committee in the Senate, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, it's to be determined still, but that's a major factor. And if the Democrats win those 2 seats in the Senate in Georgia, you're going to be looking at a major tax increase of some variety. And the SBIA is far and away your best bulwark against getting really hammered on taxes. And may even be able to create some new opportunities in a positive way for you and your LPs. So please do pay your dues. Please encourage everyone to that is an SBIC to pay their dues because we really do produce value for you and we really are looking after you. So I'll mention that. So let me stop there for a second. I don't see any more questions coming up, Tyson. So let me hand it over to Tyson. Tyson, see if you had any comments or questions, or Patrick, if you have any more questions or comments, we'll be happy to answer all of them.
Actually, Brad, it looks like Pam just put a new one in the queue there.
Do you have any idea who the candidates on each side are for the head of the Small Business Committee? It's a good question, Pam. I love Pam's questions. They're always thoughtful. So on the Senate Small Business Committee, Marco Rubio is expected to move off the committee to probably the Intel Committee or the Foreign Relations Committee. The Senate process is kind of Byzantine, and I'll spare you the pain of that. But it looks like at this point that if the Republicans hold it, Rand Paul of Kentucky, who skews very libertarian, is expected to be the Small Business Committee chair. Now, Rand Paul has, in talking to the staff over there, has attended only a handful of Small Business Committee hearings over the past many years. The Senate Small Business Committee's jurisdiction is limited to the Small Business Committee and Small Business Administration, where the House is just doing any policy with small business. So it's much broader in the House. And so he really hasn't been that actively involved. I would expect that if he ends up being chairman, you're going to see the subcommittees, which normally are irrelevant in the Senate, do the bulk of the hearings, the bulk of the legislating, and it'll be fairly simple. Now, Tim Scott of South Carolina, Patrick Weston's home state senator, may end up being the Small Business Committee chair because there's still some moving parts and some different things going on. And if that were to happen, that would be fantastic for a number of reasons, not the least of which, one, our vice chairs from South Carolina. South Carolina is clearly an underinvested state. We want to get more there. And two, Will Gardner is referred to Senator Scott as Willie G. Will used to be the staff director for his banking subcommittee. So he's known, we can work with him. That's very good. We can work with anybody and will, but that's a big question. Now, if the Democrats take it, it very well may be Ben Cardin, but it could be Jeanne Shaheen. It could be Maria Cantwell. There's a lot more moving chairs on the Democratic side if it flips than there are on the Republican side. We frankly work well with everybody on the committee, so it shouldn't matter that much. But the only concern is that historically, Rand Paul really have been significantly involved in the committee, and that makes it harder because he may have just let it lay fallow. But that can let us work, at least offensively, and go from there. So I hope that's helpful. I'll hand it back to you, Tyson.
Tyson, could I add one more thing to that? Brett, I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday. Also, Pat Toomey, who is Tony's former boss, is going to be the top Republican on the Senate Banking Committee. And we actually have a bill that from 5 to 15% that banks can invest in SBICs. And for some reason, the Senate parliamentarian always refers that to the Banking Committee, even though it's under the jurisdiction of the Small Business Committee in the House. So that's another good relationship we would have going forward with, and then another of Tony's bosses could.
Did I lose you? Tyson, can you hear that? I'm not hearing anything.
I can hear you now. Sorry, I'd lost Will there.
Okay, I lost Will. So what Will was saying was that Tani, our head of lobbying for SBIA, was also chief of staff to a gentleman named Blaine Lutkemeyer. Now, you probably can't spell it.